Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out. Tonight, I'm going to talk about PSGI and Plack. PSGI is an interface specification. If you want to know what it stands for, just so you can amaze and impress your friends, it's Perl web server gateway interface. Don't ask me why they left the W out. I guess because that makes it longer. Basically, the standard is incredibly simple. That's what often amazes people, also baffles people about PSGI and Plack, is it's so simple, people look at it and go, what do you do with this? Because, it's like, why do you need this? But hopefully after this presentation, you'll understand what it's useful for. So basically, a PSGI application is just a code reference. So literally, if you've got a piece of code that returns a code reference, that's the first piece that you need. It takes the environment as a parameter. So in other words, your application needs to accept as one parameter, which is a hash ref, which basically is your web server environment. So your typical CGI environment variables like path info, query string, that sort of thing. Then it returns an array ref of status code is the first parameter. So obviously, the ones most people know, 200, 404, 500, that sort of thing. Then an array ref of HTTP headers. Don't get thrown off. It's basically an array ref of key value pairs, the name of the header and the value. Not a hash, as some people might think, but that's probably there if you need to duplicate headers or anything for that reason. Also, apparently hopefully there's no modern day, but apparently some poorly behaved browser, i.e. 6, it actually matters what order you return some of the headers in, otherwise it gets upset. So I didn't know that until I started looking into this, and they're like, oh yeah, if you need to reorder your headers, you can do that. Anyway, hopefully that's like old stuff you don't need to worry about anymore. And the last piece is an array ref of the content, which would be like your HTML or your text or your JSON or whatever it is that this application is supposed to be returning, or an IO handle subclass of some sort, which is basically, there's a whole bunch of different subclasses. I'm not going to go into them all, but the reason you would use the IO handle subclasses is that allows you to do chunking or streaming, where you send a little bit, wait, send a little bit more, wait, send a little bit more. Whereas with the array ref, you would have that all at one time and just boom, send it back. Any questions so far? This will make a lot more sense as soon as you see some concrete code. Okay, what Plack is the Perl toolkit that implements PSGI. So a lot of people get confused between the two. PSGI is just the specification. Plack is the actual thing that you install that allows you to do PSGI stuff. So it comes with a PSGI server, which is just a HTTP server PSGI. It's single process server, very simple. It's just for development and testing while you're developing. That's why it's single process. Keep everything simple. It's got all kinds of handlers for mod Perl 1, Apache 1, Apache 2, CGI, fast CGI, all kinds, a lot more than that. I just listed some of the ones that people might be familiar with. And then you've got a bunch of middleware, which we'll talk more about later. But you've got like auth basic, and that's the type of authentication you get just directly from the server. So if you get the little gray window that pops up and it just says username, password, that's, like basic authentication. Chunked obviously does the streaming that I was referring to earlier. Log for Perl, there's a bunch of different logging middleware, as you might imagine. Log for Perl just happens to be one of the more popular logging packages. And it also comes with some apps that you can actually use. It comes with File app, which just serves up static files. We'll actually see an example of that. It comes with one that does wrap CGI, where you can literally wrap your legacy CGI programs and not have to modify them at all. So they've really made it easy to, if you've got like old CGI stuff or mod Perl stuff, to migrate away from that. They've got like several different paths you can choose. You can, to go whole hog to basically changing almost nothing to getting it to run. So a lot of different options there. Any questions there? So now basically we've talked about the specification, we've talked about the toolkit. Now let's actually look at something. Let's look at some code. So as is tradition, we have a Hello World application. All right, so the utility that you use is Plack up, which I'll show you in a little bit. This is by default is running that single process server that I was talking about earlier. Keeps things nice and simple. And so now the server is running. This is the actual code that it's running. Let me show you what it does first. Okay. Nothing very exciting. Hello world and then it gives you the PID, the process ID. Now, if I sit here and refresh on this, we can prove to ourselves, you notice that never changes because it's single process. There's a reason why I'm bringing that up. You'll see later. So we'll go back to the code here real quick. And this is how simple the code is. So you remember what our criteria was. It has to return a subroutine reference, which, as you can tell on line 8, I'm defining a subroutine. I'm assigning it to app, which I don't actually need to be doing here, but there's a reason for doing that as you build out your application. And by default, Perl will return the last value in the file. So that's a code reference, and when it hits line 16, that's what gets returned is the code reference that's in app. Okay, this code reference, what it does is it returns an array reference. You remember that was another one of the criteria of the specification. It also takes the environment, but I'm not doing that here because I don't really need it. But if I wanted to, I could have my $env equals shift above that return. And I could pull in the environment and examine the environment variables. But since I don't actually need any of them, I'm not doing that here. I'm returning a 200, which is the normal HTTP code that says, hey, everything's good. And just setting the content type header. I could set others, but that's pretty much all I needed to text HTML. And then you can tell I've just got very minimal HTML. With the people who are not familiar with the $, anytime you see a dollar at or percent followed by some punctuation, that's always a Perl built-in special variable. And that happens to be the one that returns the process ID of the current process. So that's where that's coming from. So that's literally all it's doing is saying hello world from PID. And you notice again, that's an array reference, but I put it all on one line. I could have, split it out into multiple lines if I wanted to, but it was short enough, so there was no reason to. So, is everybody following so far? You could see this is pretty simple. There's not a lot to this. And if you've done like any kind of mod Perl or CGI or anything, there's usually a lot more setup that goes into something like this than what you've got here. All right. Okay, now I'll just go through a few of the other ways. You notice that I used the first command, just plack up hello. Now I'm going to actually specify a PSGI server compatible, PSGI compatible server, I should say, called Starman, which this one is actually pre-forking, so it's multi-process, and it manages the processes and does a lot of other things. It's not just the simple one, but it's simple enough that you can use it for testing too. If you get to the point where you actually want to test, multi-process scenarios, then it's a nice and easy one to use. So we'll go ahead and start that one up. Okay, and you notice too that if I wanted to log all this, this is just like your access log. Basically, it's just going. Actually, I can't remember if it's standard out or standard error, but whichever it is, I could be redirecting that to a file if I actually cared about what it is. So again, this is the same program. The only thing we're doing differently now is we're running it off of a different server. So now, when I sit here and click on this, you notice the numbers are it's not going to be different every time, but you notice that I'm getting different numbers because it forked off a bunch of child processes so that it can answer multiple requests. Which is more like real life, because if you had a web server that was a single process, it can only handle one person at a time. And you can imagine, like, if, how horrible around here it would be if only one person in the entire world could buy a ticket at a time. That would obviously not work. So that's why you need multi-process or multi-threaded servers so that they can serve multiple requests simultaneously. Does that make sense to everybody so far? All right. Then as a bonus, this is the command that I actually use the most, just with a -R. And right now you're not going to see anything that much different, except the process ID numbers are slightly different because I restarted the server. But what's cool about it is if I go, oops, and let's just say I change this and then save it. You can see here, successfully killed. So killing the existing server. So it automatically detected that the file that it was serving up changed and restarted the server. This is really, really, really nice as you're developing. You probably wouldn't want to, necessarily do that in a production situation, but as you're developing, this is just super nice to not have to constantly restart the server every time you change the file. So now let's prove to ourselves that it actually did do that, and there you go. So I didn't have to restart it myself. I just changed the file. It detected that I changed the file, and now it says hi world instead of hello world. So Again, that's the way I normally run things, is with that version of the command. And I'll just point out, by default, it's on port 5000. You can change that to whatever you want. There's a bunch of other command line arguments where you can change a whole bunch of different things. But again, this is introduction, so I'm just going over the basics. This is more broad talk than a deep talk. So, all right. Now we're going to do something a little more interesting than just saying hello. We're actually going to set up a static web server, which just means, by static, I just mean we've just got a bunch of HTML pages with no variable data. It's not pulling from databases or anything. And I'll basically show you the code. Well, first I'll show you how it's running. Oops. Oh, wrong tab. Okay. And what you can see here is that I got an index. This is pretty similar if any of you have worked with Apache and you don't have an index file, or you've got it configured to, generate its own indexes. That's exactly what this is doing. And basically what I'm serving up here is just the Perl documentation. So I literally just downloaded and installed this, and I'm just serving this up locally. So no magic here. I just wanted something to serve up. So I'm like, oh, why not download the Perl docs? So it's like, yeah, there's a bunch of stuff there. So just tossed it in there. So it's currently doing that. Now let's look at the code and be amazed by how little code there actually is. That's the code right there. What we've got going on that's different now is, you remember I said that basically you've got handlers that come with Plack. You've got middleware that comes with Plack. You also have apps that come with Plack. This is one of the apps. I'm actually using app directory rather than app file. Really, they're almost identical. The only difference is directory will generate an index for you. Whereas if I'd used file here and just hit the root, I would have gotten a 404. So not very interesting. I figured this was better. Other than that, they're virtually identical. I just tell it where my root directory is, which is just the current directory inside of www. I say call the toApp method, and that gets returned, and there you go. That's your static web server. You could actually set up, I'm not going to get into all the syntax for this. You can look at the documentation if you're interested. But you can actually have, like, if I wanted to go /Perl and have that do the Perl documentation, /Python and have that do the Python documentation, whatever, /man, have it do man pages that are in HTML or something. You can actually have it, set up and just do that and easily serve up a whole bunch of static content. Now, obviously, static content's not terribly interesting in most cases, but it's extremely easy to do. So, any questions there so far? All right. All right. Now we're going to talk about some of the middleware. Okay, Plack Builder is just kind of a utility class that provides a domain-specific language, DSL. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that term. But basically, the idea is create usually a simple language that's for a very specific task. So it's creating its own syntax that's, slightly, it's Perlish, slightly different than the normal Perl syntax, but it's for to make things convenient for you and very simple. So like if, they're trying to think of a good example of another DSL. Oh, actually, yeah. I can't talk about that, but anyway, yeah, my last job, we actually did have a DSL. That's the first thing that came to mind, but sorry, I can't talk about that on camera. But basically, this is what it looks like. I don't know if you in the back can see that, but basically at the top it says Builder, and then we've got a code block, and then it says enable foo, enable bar with the option value. That's obviously just stuff that was made up. And then it's returning the app at the bottom, because again, you need to always return that code reference. Versus this is what you can also do it this way, but you have to use the module that you want first. You have to fully specify the full name of the module, and you have to call wrap. And you have to do all of that for every piece of middleware that you have. Now, obviously, so far we haven't seen anything, but you can actually, if you're doing any kind of non-trivial application, you're going to have a bunch of middleware. So you would obviously pick the first option over the second, I think, in most cases, because the first one automatically loads the modules for you. Plus, you don't even have to specify the Plack middleware part of it. If it's in that namespace, it'll automatically just figure it out. You can also specify things outside of that namespace by putting a plus in front of the name and then just fully specifying it if it's outside of that namespace. But pretty much all the standard CPAN stuff is going to be in this namespace. Usually it'll be the stuff you're writing yourself that might be outside. So obviously we can make that last application better, because guess what? There was actually an index.html in there, right? I went down, searched for it, and went to it. So rather than seeing the actual server created index page, I'd rather just go to index.html. So now we're going to go ahead and do that, and I'll show you how easy that is. So come on. Oh, no. Sorry, wrong file. Okay, now, when we go back to this, you notice we're on Perlfac. I'm going to go all the way back to the index and then reload it. Voila. Now we've got our index file the way we would normally want it. Okay, so let's have a look at the code here. So you can see this code is not terribly much more complicated. Basically, up until line 9 is identical to the code I just showed you before. The only thing that's changed, well, other than the line 7, we pulled in Plack Builder. And so we set up our builder and then our block. We said enable dir index, which that's a piece of middleware that doesn't come with Plack, but someone else created it because they said, hey, I want... Again, the idea of this is to make things as stupidly simple as possible, and then you put the pieces together to build up more complex things. So the first thing just serves files. That's it. The next level up serves files and creates, directory indexes. This will actually look to see if there's an index.html right there. If it doesn't exist, then it will go ahead and create a directory index. If it does exist, it serves that up instead, which again, you know, those of you who've used Apache are probably familiar with that kind of behavior. So that's all I'm doing. Enable dir index, and then I'm passing in the parameter dir index is index.html. If I wanted to follow Windows conventions, boo, hiss, I would, you know, I could change that to index.htm, and then that would work, you know, instead. So just so you know, I could change that to anything. And if that file exists, then it's going to serve that up as the index file. It doesn't have to be, there's nothing magical about index.html here, other than I'm just following, you know, standard conventions.
It's not going to update index.html if the actual directory is detailed?
No, basically any directory, even if it's a subdirectory, if it's got an index.html, it'll load that instead of displaying that plain white directory that we saw earlier. All right? Again, I know probably seems really simple, but the idea is that you start with simple pieces and you just keep building. And the thing that's cool about these middlewares are that you can use them with any application that follows the PSGI standard. So anything that follows this standard, you can just download that and throw it in and go, you know, suddenly you've got a new functionality to your application just by downloading and adding like one line that says enable. I mean, it's really simple to add new functionality. All right, I'm going to close a few of these just so I don't confuse myself too much. Okay, and I've been skipping a lot of these links. I've got these links in here for people after this talk is put up on YouTube, and you can download all this. All these links go off to the documentation for these, so you can look at more at what they do. But I'm not going to go through that right now. Okay. So now let's do something a little more interesting. I'd mentioned authentication earlier. So I'm going to just throw in authentication into the app that we've been slowly building up here. So this is my new file. And just starting that up. And then we come back here, we reload. Guess what? I'm not allowed in anymore without actually typing in the correct username and password. So let's say Doug and a bunch of garbage. Nope, not going to do it. And of course, I mistype it when there we go. So now you can actually see that it's letting me in. And this is the same as every other web server you've probably seen, where I can sit here and reload and refresh, and as long as I've got this browser session going, you know, I'm authenticated for this browser session. If I close out of the browser, or do what I'm going to actually do here, which is, this one. If I do this, and then refresh it, I just basically cleared out my session, so now I've got to relog in. And again, this is no different than Apache would act under these same circumstances. Okay. So now let's actually look at the code. Let's see what I added. Okay, basically everything up through Line 9, we've seen before. We've seen Builder before. Now lines 13 through 16 are the new and interesting parts here. So I say enable auth basic, and remember that's actually Plack middleware auth basic. And then I just give it an authenticator, which is just a subroutine reference. And I could do anything in here. Obviously, I'm doing something stupidly simple just to illustrate. Obviously, this would be horrible security to just have plain text passwords in here. But you could actually have this going out and authenticating against LDAP or, anything else, any other system that you've got. Yeah, actually, oh, go ahead. I'll let you ask the question first, but
I don't know if it's actually related. I'm just curious because you
Yeah.
mentioned a couple different times how, comparing this to Apache specifically. Apache obviously has this entire, depending on the version, this entire life cycle.
Yeah.
Deal with requests, so you can obviously throw plugins to that to do something like this right here.
uh-huh.
Is this built on top of anything, any other standard outside of, obviously this is an Apache, is there any other kind of standard, or did it build this
Just-
entire life cycle model?
The life cycle model is not different. The other thing that is similar to any other web server is basically the environment variables, right? That's how you communicate and how you basically your get, your post, your head, your, all of that. It's just the typical standards just built in a different way. And then basically the difference is the way that your application gets called by the web server. That's the basic difference. This actually works similar to mod Perl in that it compiles it up and it's actually part of the process, part of the server process that's running. So it's not like CGI where every time you hit it, it has to recompile it, load it, recompile it, run it. Doesn't do that. When this pre-forks, it compiles everything and builds everything and loads everything, and it just sits there waiting.
There's database caching, connection caching.
You could do any of that type of stuff. Yes.
How does this relate to some of the bigger frameworks like Catalyst?
I'm glad you asked that question, actually. That's an excellent question. So basically there are, and if I went to the page, which maybe I'll do at the end of the talk if we have time, there's a bunch of different frameworks out there. Just like for Java, you've got struts and you've got Spring and you've got all these different kinds of frameworks. Well, in the Perl world, it's no different. You've got Mojolicious, you've got Dancer, you've got Catalyst, which I think is probably the most popular one. Well, what happened was all of those guys, had done all of their implementation themselves of, well, how do we make it work for mod Perl, or how do we make it run under CGI? Because some people, obviously non-technical people or semi-technical people that didn't need the full enterprise capabilities of mod Perl wanted to run it in CGI mode. Well, eventually they quit supporting that. So guess what? Those people that wanted to run it in CGI mode were either stuck at the version they were at, or they were screwed and they had to go find a different framework. I actually saw some discussion as I was doing this research, obviously old stuff when before this was built, people going, oh man, the CGI support is going away. That's terrible. So what happened is when this came along, all of those guys go, man, this is really cool. Now we don't have to have all of this code, which was, basically, I'm assuming different, or at least somewhat different amongst all of those frameworks, took out all that middle chunk of code between the application and the server and replaced it with this. So now, guess what? Those people get back CGI. If they want to run it in CGI mode, they can now run Catalyst in CGI mode again because of this. They can run it as mod Perl. They could run it, with Starman. And there's like a dozen other servers out there. So there's a whole bunch of servers to choose from. And again, you can go through the documentation. It'll list, like, it's got links to all these different servers that support it. So that's basically, hopefully I answered your question, is basically those guys went back and retrofitted this back into their frameworks. So, yeah, this is basically the interface for them. Yeah. Well, the event loop can be part of this, which there are actually other modules, which I'm not going to get into event loops too much in this talk, but I did read some about them. So there are several different, like PO and CoRo and some other things like that, event loops that Perl's got around that, yes, you can integrate with this and it works great. So that's basically what those guys got to save. And then you can actually very easily migrate from server to server. You can start out in CGI mode, and then if you outgrow that, then you can go to mod Perl or fast CGI or something else. So it really just is decoupling you. It's very similar to DBI. For those of you that are familiar with DBI, the way DBI decouples you from the database. I mean, obviously you've still got the fact that SQL is standard, which means it's different for every single stinking database out there. But regardless of that fact, if you're writing standard SQL that's at least somewhat portable, then you can pretty easily migrate between databases with DBI because it makes it easy. So this basically serves the same function. It's kind of a shim between your application and any kind of web server out there that you can think of to run against. So, and not only that's the basic purpose of it, but you get a lot more out of it. You can see how easy it is to just, in small little bits, just build up your application piece by piece and just keep adding little pieces to it. Any other questions? Okay. Oops. All right. This is one of the cooler parts, I think. Basically, there's a Plack middleware debug, and I'll not spoil the fun. I'll actually just show you what it does. Let's see, that was, yep. Okay, now running that. I'm just going to reload this. And oh my gosh, look at that. So what we've got here is we've got our environment. So we can sit and look if we think we've got something funky going on in the environment. We can actually look at that. You can see this is how PSGI does. It's got its own basic key value pair thing, just like the headers, but it just starts with PSGI and then whatever dot namespace you want to give your own variables for your own application. And that allows you can see the last one, that's actually Perl code down there, right? It's it's basically a do block. So you can actually, pass around code, pass around, hash references, array references, whatever you want. Any kind of complex data structures, JSON strings, JSON that's been converted into, Perl code. So, but again, we're keeping this relatively simple, so I'm not going to go much deeper into this other than to just let you know that this is how you can pass more information into your application, because you can actually chain applications. So you may have one application that generates some information for another application, which then runs. And it knows which key to pull its data out of, and it does that. You can also have applications that wrap other applications, which that's basically the definition of the middleware. Is basically that's what it does. Is it wraps it gets called before and it gets called after your application, and it's basically like an onion. So it's like whatever's gets called last gets called first on the way out, and then out from there. All right. Then you can look at the response that we got. It tells you the content length, just basic things. You can see this is the Starman server is actually stupidly fast. It is incredibly fast. I mean, this is just my work laptop, nothing special, but for static page, it's just like, obviously if this were on a real server, there'd probably be another couple extra zeros in front of that. And this is also extremely useful. You can see if you've got a memory leak, especially if you go back to the single process and just hit it over and over and over again. You can see if your memory is growing. And if it keeps growing and growing and growing, you've got a memory leak somewhere. So anyway, and then you can obviously close all this. This is just pretty much an overlay over whatever it is you're serving up, and you can hide it and all of that. Okay, so now I've wowed you with what it does. Now let's actually look at what it took to get that added. So again, I'm building off of the authentication app. Again, just one more step. So all I did, one line, enable debug. That's it, to add that in. The other thing is, I'm fairly certain I didn't get a chance to look into this, but I think there are other debug plugins that give you more information. That's just the default right there. I think there are actually other middlewares that actually allow you to add more panels and more information to the debug that you get on the side. I won't swear to that because, like I said, I didn't get a chance to look into it, but I'm pretty sure I ran across some things while I was reading up on this. So, any questions now, so far? And you can see I put debug at the top because, you want your debugging before you do anything else, right? So that would be like the outer layer of the onion. Then the next layer is the authentication. Then the next layer is the directory index. And then the next layer is the app, which is app directory. Or it could be my app. I could have some completely different code reference up here that does something completely different. Which, again, we're not going to get too much into tonight because I'm just trying to keep it simple. Any questions before I go on? We all good? All right. Okay. This is, again, one of the ultra super cool things. As especially you TicketMaster people know, testing. We've been talking a lot about testing recently, right? Everybody's been hearing about testing for actually more than recently. It's been a while we've been talking about testing. Usually, web applications are notoriously hard to test. There's a lot of various different ways of doing it, and some of them work, better to one degree or another, depending on what it is, the application you're testing, and whatever testing framework you're using. But let me show you what you can do with Plack and testing. So I will bring up that code. I'm actually going to just going to use prove like you normally would with Perl. Hello test. We run it and it failed. And that's interesting. The dangers of running code while you're doing a presentation. Oh, guess what? It failed. You know why it failed? This is actually wonderful. I'm happy it failed. Guess what? I modified the application. I changed it, so my test failed. which is exactly what I want to see. That proves to me my test is working fine because I changed the code, therefore I broke my unit test. So let's undo the change. Luckily, I remembered I did this. And let's rerun the test. Okay, and there we go. All tests successful. The reason was, as you'll see right here in the code, as I show you the test. Now I'll spend a little bit more time with this file because, again, now this is a test file, not a PSGI file. So we're switching gears here. We're talking about testing. So strict warnings like we always do. Plack test, Plack util for, you'll see one of the things I'm using from the utility library. And then HTTP request common, which actually has nothing to do with Plack, but it's just an easy way to make HTTP requests. So test more, which is, again, one of the most standard way of testing, unit testing in Perl. So any of you Perl guys, I'm sure, have seen this stuff before. I tell it how many tests I've got. I've got 2. I'm, again, hello world. I mean, how many tests can you come up with? I came up with 2. I could have come up with more, but they wouldn't have been very useful. Okay, so line 10 is where I'm actually pulling from util. You can either inline a little block of if your application was simple enough, like that's what I was seeing in all the examples, is they just have that block of hello world code right there. But I was like, yeah, that's not how I would do it in real life. So I want to show an example like how you would do it in real life. What that literally does is that's doing the same thing as running Plack up, that command I keep running over and over and over again. That's starting the server, but it's starting it in such a way that you can just run tests against it. So I'm loading up the PSGI file, hello, which is the very first one. You remember way back at the beginning of the talk, the very first one I showed you just says hello world from PID blah, whatever the PID number is. So from Plack test, you get test PSGI. So you pass in your app. Obviously, it needs to know what it's testing. And then you give it an anonymous subroutine or just a subroutine reference. You get the callback, which is the actual app that it's running or that it's testing against, and then I run a get on /. You notice I don't even have to specify localhost or port or anything. I just what I want. It automatically figures out all of that stuff for me. I don't have to do any of it. So I'm just saying, give me the root of whatever you serve up here. And in hello, I didn't have anything other than you hit the root, you get the hello message. That's it. So that's all we're doing. And then we're just doing an is response code 200, which meant everything got returned from the server A-OK. Now I don't even have to uncomment line 19 because what I did is I did the reverse of that. I was going to show a breaking test by basically comparing against a string that I'm not getting back, but you just saw that, so I'm not even going to bother. And then it's checking the content using a regular expression, hello world from PID, and then I've got \d plus because I have no idea how long the PID's going to be, how many digits. I just know it's going to be digits. So if it doesn't match that, as you saw earlier when I changed hello to hi, then it blows up. It goes up, failed the test. It didn't do what I expected it to do. But then once I changed hi back to hello, then it passed. So again, this is a stupidly simple example, but you can see how easy it is to just go ahead and run this and not have to be worried about your server environment or, any proxies you've got going on or anything, because we're unit testing here, right? We shouldn't be worried about that kind of stuff. We're just worried about what does our code do? When you hit this URL, what do you get back? And that's what you should be worried at the unit test level. That's what you should be worried about.
This code that you added to, is that the two tests item, or is it two times?
It's two items.
Okay.
This and this are the two tests. If I uncommented this, it would fail and it would complain that I have three tests instead of two, is what it would do. So yeah, a lot of times it's not like it'll blow up if your number is wrong, but it will warn you. It'll say, hey, you told me you were going to run this many tests and you ran this many instead. It'll still run them all, but it'll just complain at you.
I assume that since the server doesn't really care about what you're getting, if you get like, if you did a get/foo/bar, it would still just return hello.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. That's it. Any questions? Oh, good. 6 minutes early. So those of you who were here last month and had to say an extra half hour, I just gave you 6 minutes back. Yeah. I'll work on it. Oh, that's a good question for people who are not familiar with unit testing in Perl. So the is, you'll notice, has two parameters. I've got the response code and the 200. So that's doing a comparison. It's saying, is this equal to this? Right. And if so, true. If not, false, it fails. Okay just takes one. And it just says, if this, whatever the statement is true, then I'm good. If not, I fail. And that's why it failed when I, changed hello to hi. Because then it didn't match the regular expression anymore, and it was a false statement. So that's why it failed. So, any other questions? All right. Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. I hope you learned something from this. I hope it was worth it. If nothing else, you got free pizza.